It was a still afternoon in a quiet neighborhood. The kind where life unfolded at an unhurried pace. The streets, lined with modest homes and shaded by old oaks, felt as familiar as an old photograph. Officer Jack Mather had driven this route countless times before. He knew the rhythms of this neighborhood, the joggers with their dogs, the children on bicycles, the retirees tending their flower beds. Everything about it was ordinary, predictable. That afternoon, predictability gave way to something else. A car, a faded green sedan, caught Jack's attention. It wasn't speeding or weaving dangerously, but it did drift slightly as it approached the intersection. To Jack, it was enough. Maybe the driver was distracted. Maybe something more. He couldn't say for certain. But the nagging instinct of his profession prompted him to flick on his lights. The car pulled over near a small park. Slowing with care, Jack parked behind it, radioing in the stop as procedure dictated. Stepping out of his cruiser, he adjusted his belt unconsciously, the routine settling in like muscle memory. As he approached the driver's side window, he caught a glimpse of the woman behind the wheel. She was black, middle-aged, with a calm but wary expression that reminded him of someone bracing for a storm. "License and registration," he said, his tone flat, procedural. The woman, Sarah Williams, as her documents would later reveal, responded with slow, deliberate movements, retrieving the papers and handing them over. Her hand trembled slightly, though her face remained composed. "Officer, may I ask why I've been stopped?" Jack's response was curt. "You swerved at the light back there. Just making sure everything's in order." Sarah blinked. "I didn't realize she began. But he cut her off. "Step out of the vehicle." The request came abruptly, his tone sharper than it needed to be. Jack could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes. But she complied without protest, unbuckling her seatbelt and stepping out. Inside the car, her daughter, Amara, sat watching the exchange. Amara was young, maybe 12 or so, with an air of stillness about her that felt too practiced for a child. Her legs were strapped into braces, their metal glinting in the sunlight. She had cerebral palsy, a detail Jack noted but didn't dwell on. "She okay?" Jack asked, gesturing toward the girl in the car. His voice carried the clipped edge of someone asking out of duty rather than concern. "She's fine," Sarah replied. "She has cerebral palsy. I was adjusting her seatbelt." "Which might be why the car swerved." "There's nothing wrong here." Jack folded his arms. "People don't swerve for no reason." It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them, an undercurrent of suspicion, as though her explanation had already been dismissed. Sarah's jaw tightened. She glanced at Amara, who was shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her braces pressing awkwardly against her legs. "Officer," Sarah said carefully, "I've explained the situation. There's no need for this." Jack's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being questioned, and something about her tone, a quiet defiance, irritated him. "Stay here," he ordered, moving around to the passenger side. Amara stiffened as he approached, her small hands gripping the armrest. Jack opened the door, leaning in to inspect the seatbelt. It was an action meant to assert control, to show that he was the one in charge. But it had the opposite effect. Amara flinched at his sudden proximity, her body tensing as if anticipating something worse. "Stop," she said, her voice quivering but clear. "Don't touch me." Jack froze for a moment, surprised by her reaction. Then his face hardened. "Tell your daughter to calm down," he said, addressing Sarah over his shoulder. Sarah stepped closer, her voice rising. "She's scared. You're making her uncomfortable. Step back," Jack snapped, shoving Sarah lightly but firmly. She stumbled, not from the force but from the shock of it. "Officer, please," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "She's disabled. She can't move the way you're making her." But Jack wasn't listening, or maybe he was. But the message didn't register in the way it should have. He grabbed Amara's arm, his grip rougher than he realized, and began pulling her out of the car. The girl let out a yelp of pain, her braces twisting awkwardly against the seat. By then, people in the park had begun to notice. A few had already pulled out their phones, recording silently from a distance. The scene was quiet, save for Sarah's panicked pleas and Amara's muffled sobs. Yet, There was something about that silence and unspoken understanding among the onlookers of what this was and what it could become. My dad is an FBI agent. Amara cried suddenly, her voice breaking through the tension like a crack of thunder. Jack hesitated. He loosened his grip, though not entirely. He turned, scanning the growing crowd, noticing the phones pointed his way. For the first time, he felt the ground shift beneath him. A creeping awareness that this situation was no longer his to control. The air hung heavy with something unspoken. The kind of weight that comes when a moment seemingly small reveals the fault lines running through a much larger landscape. Jack looked at Sarah, then at Amara, and then at the crowd. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that this wasn't going to end well. But he didn't move. By evening, the quiet suburb where the incident occurred had returned to its usual rhythm. The park was empty now, the streetlights casting long shadows over the benches and pathways. Yet, elsewhere in living rooms, on phones, and across television screens the day's events were coming to life in a way neither Officer Jack Mather nor Sarah Williams could have anticipated. The video, captured by a steady hand in the park, was less than 2 minutes long. It showed everything: the sharp commands, Sarah's pleading, Amara's tears, and the officer's grip on the young girl's arm. It ended with Amara's desperate cry, "My dad is an FBI agent." That single line, spoken with both fear and defiance, seemed to crystallize the moment, giving it a resonance far beyond the neighborhood where it had occurred. It wasn't long before the video began its steady march through social media. A few clicks turned into thousands of shares, each with captions that added weight to the unfolding narrative. Officer assaults disabled black girl. Justice for Amara. By the time the news outlets picked it up, the story had already begun to grow beyond the event itself, becoming a symbol of something larger, something simmering just beneath the surface of everyday life. Blank. Blank. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, as though even the walls were holding their breath. Upstairs, Amara was asleep, her face still streaked with the tears she'd shed earlier. Sarah had tucked her in, smoothing her daughter's hair and whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed herself. Her phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with notifications. Messages from friends, acquaintances, even strangers, some offering support, others demanding to know what had happened. Sarah hadn't responded to any of them. She didn't have the energy to explain what she barely understood herself. Across town, Jack Mather sat in his living room, the faint glow of the television casting shadows across his face. The news anchor spoke in measured tones, describing the video that was now circulating online. They used words like disturbing and controversial. Jack's name hadn't been released yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. The footage played again, a grainy loop of his interaction with Sarah and Amara. Watching it now, Jack saw something he hadn't in the moment. He saw the way Sarah had stepped between him and her daughter. Her movements protective but restrained. He saw the way Amara had flinched, her small frame twisting awkwardly in her seat. He saw himself, towering over them both, his actions recorded in stark detail. It didn't look good, even to him. Blank. By the next morning, the story had spread further. Major news outlets began running segments on the video, weaving it into a broader conversation about policing and race in America. Experts weighed in, their voices calm but firm as they discussed systemic issues and patterns of behavior. The story was no longer about one officer, one woman, or one child. It was about the fabric of a society that could allow such moments to occur at all. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time. A call. She hesitated before answering. "Hello? Sarah, it's Ethan." Her husband's voice was steady, but she could hear the strain beneath it. Ethan Carter was thousands of miles away, working a case in another state. But he had seen the video. He didn't have to ask for details, the footage spoke for itself. "I'm coming home," he said after a pause. "I've already spoken to my supervisor. We'll handle this." Sarah's throat tightened. "Ethan, it's everywhere. They're talking about us like we're symbols," he finished. "I know, But this isn't just about us anymore. She closed her eyes, exhaustion seeping into her bones. Amara, she's scared. Ethan, she kept asking if people will believe her. What do I even say to that? You tell her the truth. He replied. That what happened to her wasn't her fault. That people do believe her. And that we're going to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. Blank. Underscore. Blank. At the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers whispered in hallways, their voices low but urgent. The chief, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor, called an emergency meeting. The department had issued a statement, emphasizing an internal investigation and promising transparency. But the words felt hollow even as they were spoken. Jack sat at his desk, staring at the paperwork he was supposed to be finishing. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, some sympathetic, others critical. He wasn't sure which was worse. You're on administrative leave, the chief had told him earlier that morning. His tone curt, effective immediately. Go home, Mather. Jack had nodded, but the words stung. He knew what administrative leave meant. It was the department's way of buying time, of distancing itself while deciding whether to support him or sacrifice him. He wasn't sure which way it would go. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, a small crowd had begun to gather. They held signs with messages like, "Justice for Amara," and "End police violence." Their voices were calm but insistent. A quiet demand for accountability. Among them were people who had never met Sarah or Amara. People who had never even heard of the neighborhood where it all happened. But they knew the story because it wasn't new. It was just the latest chapter in a book they'd been reading for decades. In her kitchen, Sarah finally picked up her phone. She scrolled through the messages, pausing at one from an old friend. I saw the video. I'm so sorry. How are you holding up? She typed a reply, her fingers trembling slightly. We're managing. Thank you for checking in. Then she set the phone down and stared out the window. The sun was shining. The day as ordinary as any other. Yet, nothing felt ordinary anymore. For Sarah, for Amara, and even for Jack. The events of that afternoon were far from over. The world had seen what happened. And now, the world was watching. The precinct was unusually quiet, though the stillness felt more like the hush of a gathering storm than the calm of routine. Officer Jack Mather sat in the break room, the scent of stale coffee clinging to the air. His hands rested on the table, fidgeting slightly, a nervous habit he hadn't noticed before. The usual chatter of his colleagues had faded in recent days, replaced by sidelong glances and hurried whispers that ceased whenever he entered the room. The video had changed everything. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore, it was a symbol. A rallying cry for protests growing larger each day. Jack's face tight-lipped and stern was now the face of a controversy that stretched far beyond him. He'd seen the clips replayed on the news, on his phone, even in his dreams. Each time, the same cold knot formed in his stomach. He wasn't sure if it was guilt or anger or both. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The station chief, James Holloway, stood at the window of his office, watching the small crowd gathered outside. Their signs bobbed in the morning light. Justice for Amara. End police violence. Their voices were steady, not loud but resolute. For Holloway, it was a sight he'd seen before, though it never got easier. He turned as Sergeant Clara Davis entered, a file tucked under her arm. It's not slowing down, she said, nodding toward the window. More people showed up this morning. Holloway sighed. I figured. Any word from the mayor? She wants a statement, something decisive, but she's also made it clear this can't become a federal matter. Holloway rubbed his temples. The problem wasn't just the protesters. It was the video, the news cycle, the scrutiny from Washington. It was the fact that Amara Williams wasn't just any child, she was the daughter of Ethan Carter, a respected FBI agent with a spotless reputation and an unforgiving sense of justice. We're past the point of containment, Holloway said finally. Put Mather on administrative leave. Full suspension. The DOJ's sniffing around. And we need to look cooperative. Davis hesitated. And when the investigation starts digging into old complaints. Holloway's jaw tightened. Then we deal with it. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Jack had expected support from the department. The kind of solidarity he'd seen extended to others in difficult situations. But this time was different. He wasn't being defended. He was being distanced from subtly at first, then more overtly as the days passed. The silence of his colleagues was as loud as the chants outside. He thought back to the moment in the park, trying to piece together where things had gone wrong. He remembered Sarah's expression, calm at first, then pleading. He remembered Amara's cry, her body twisting awkwardly as she tried to pull away. In his mind, it had been a routine stop, one that escalated only because of their resistance. But was that the whole truth? Jack didn't want to dwell on the question, but it lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. The footage had stripped away the nuances he'd used to justify his actions. The video wasn't about protocol or control. It was about a black mother, her disabled daughter, and an officer who had acted without thinking of the consequences. Blank. Blank. At home, Sarah Williams sat with her husband, Ethan, the weight of the last few days pressing heavily on them both. Ethan's return had brought a measure of comfort, but it hadn't erased the fear that still lingered. Amara sat nearby, coloring quietly, though her usual chatter was absent. "They're saying there will be an investigation," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady but tinged with doubt. "But what does that really mean?" "It means they'll try to make this go away quietly," Ethan replied. His tone was calm, almost clinical, but Sarah could see the tension in his posture. "Unless we make it impossible for them to ignore." Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowing. "You think they'll bury it?" "I think they'll try. That's how it works. They'll investigate, maybe suspend him. But real accountability? That only happens when people keep pushing." Sarah glanced at Amara, her heart aching at the sight of her daughter's subdued demeanor. "I just want her to feel safe again. To know that people are on her side." "They are," Ethan said, his voice softening. "You've seen the protests. The support. People care about this, Sarah. About her. Blank. Blank. Back at the precinct, Jack was called into the chief's office. The walk down the hall felt longer than usual, each step weighed down by the unspoken knowledge of what was coming. When he entered, Chief Holloway gestured for him to sit. "This isn't easy, Jack," the chief began, his tone measured. "But we have to address what's happening." Jack shifted in his seat, his palms resting on his thighs. "I've been following protocol." "This isn't about protocol," Holloway interrupted, his voice firm. "This is about perception, about public trust. The DOJ is looking into this, Jack. They're looking into you." Jack's jaw tightened. "I was doing my job. And now you're a liability," Holloway said bluntly. "We're suspending you without pay. Effective immediately. The investigation will determine what happens next." The words hit Jack harder than he'd expected. He had thought the department would stand by him, that they would weather the storm together. But as Holloway spoke, it became clear that he was being left to face the fallout alone. As Jack left the office, the weight of the decision settled on him. He wasn't sure what was worse, the public outcry, the media scrutiny, or the silence of his colleagues. For the first time, he felt truly isolated, a man untethered from the system he had once relied on. Blank. Outside, the protests continued, their quiet persistence a reminder that the story was far from over. For Sarah, Ethan, and Amara, the fight for accountability was only just beginning. And for Jack, the reckoning he now faced wasn't just about the events in the park. It was about the choices he had made and the ones he hadn't. The air inside the precinct was heavy, as if the building itself had absorbed the tension from the events of the past week. Officers moved quietly, their conversations hushed and purposeful. The usual camaraderie was absent, replaced by an undercurrent of unease. No one openly mentioned Officer Jack Mather, but his name hung over the station like a shadow. Jack sat alone in the break room, staring at the cold cup of coffee in his hands. The noise of the station felt distant, muffled, as though he had already been cut off from the place he had called his professional home for years. His suspension had been announced that morning, and though it wasn't a surprise, the finality of it still stung. He glanced at his phone. The messages had slowed, though the earlier flood of texts and voicemails from reporters, strangers, even distant relatives still weighed on him. Most were scathing, demanding justice for the girl in the video. A few offered support, but even those felt hollow. Jack set the phone down, unwilling to read another word. The door creaked open, and a young officer stepped in, her eyes darting nervously. "Officer Mather," she said, her voice uncertain. "There's someone here to see you." Jack frowned. "Who?" "Ethan Carter," she replied, barely above a whisper. Jack's breath caught. He had known this moment might come, though he hadn't expected it so soon. He set the cup down carefully, as if any sudden movement might tip the fragile equilibrium of the room. "Send him in," he said, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. Blank. Blank. Ethan Carter entered the room with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to control. He was tall, his demeanor calm but purposeful. His dark suit and the polished badge on his hip left no doubt about who he was or the authority he carried. Jack stood as Ethan approached, unsure whether to extend a hand or keep his distance. Ethan didn't offer a handshake, nor did he sit. Instead, he stood across the table, his presence filling the room. "You know why I'm here," Ethan began, his voice even but firm. Jack nodded, swallowing hard. "I figured as much." Ethan studied him for a moment, his gaze sharp but not overtly hostile. "My daughter," he said slowly, "is 12 years old. She has cerebral palsy. She sat in that car, terrified, while you," he paused, as though searching for the right words, "while you decided to assert your authority in the worst possible way." Jack opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no defense that wouldn't sound weak, no justification that wouldn't crumble under the weight of the video. "I didn't know who she was," Jack said finally, his voice quiet. Ethan's expression didn't change. "Does it matter?" The question landed heavily, as if it carried the weight of all the unspoken injustices that had led to this moment. Jack looked away, his gaze falling to the table. "I thought I was following procedure," he murmured. "Procedure," Ethan repeated, the words sharp and deliberate. "Tell me, Officer Mather, does your procedure involve dragging a disabled child from her car? Ignoring a mother's pleas? Escalating a situation that never should have been a situation in the first place?" Jack flinched at the words, though Ethan's tone never rose. He wanted to say something, to explain that he hadn't meant for things to go that far, that he had been trying to do his job. But the words wouldn't come. They felt hollow, even to him. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "This isn't just about my daughter. This is about the choices you made, the assumptions you brought with you when you stopped that car, and the consequences you're going to face." Jack looked up then, meeting Ethan's gaze for the first time. There was no anger in the man's eyes, but there was something far more unsettling and unyielding certainty that Jack had no way out of this. "You've seen the protests," Ethan continued. "You've seen the video. You know this isn't going away quietly." Jack nodded, the motion almost imperceptible. "I know. For your sake, I hope you've started to think about what comes next," Ethan said, straightening. "Because I promise you, Officer Mather, there will be accountability, not just for you, but for every part of the system that allowed this to happen." With that, Ethan turned and walked toward the door. He paused just before leaving, glancing back over his shoulder. "And if you think this is about revenge, you're wrong. It's about justice. For my daughter, and for every person who's ever sat where she did." The door closed softly behind him, leaving Jack alone once more. He sat back down, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what had happened, not just the event itself, but the ripple it had created. The crowd outside, the investigations, the calls for reform, they were all part of something larger. Something he had become the unwilling face of. Blank. Outside, Ethan walked past the protesters, their signs and chants blending into the background. He didn't stop to speak to the media or engage with the onlookers. His focus was singular: his family. At home, Sarah was waiting for him. Amara sat at the kitchen table, coloring quietly, her small hands steady for the first time in days. Ethan placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder as he sat beside her. "What did he say?" Sarah asked softly. Nothing that mattered, Ethan replied. He glanced at Amara, her face serene but distant. But he knows this isn't over. Amara looked up then, her eyes meeting her father's. Did he apologize? Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. No. Amara nodded, as if she had expected that answer. It doesn't matter, she said quietly. I just want him to understand. Ethan leaned closer, his voice low but firm. He does now, sweetheart. I promise you, he does. The house settled into a quiet stillness. The kind that felt more like a pause than an ending. Outside, the world continued to grapple with the story. The protests growing louder, the calls for change more insistent. For the Williams family, it was a moment of calm in the eye of a storm that was far from over. The Department of Justice's letter arrived at the precinct on a gray Monday morning. Its words meticulously chosen yet unyielding. The investigation would begin immediately, focusing not only on Officer Jack Mather's actions but also on the broader practices of the police department. For Chief Holloway, it was the culmination of days of mounting pressure. He read the letter in silence, his face betraying no emotion, though his clenched fist around the paper told a different story. For Jack, the letter marked another step toward the inevitable. The thin thread of departmental loyalty that had once tied him to his colleagues had frayed to near invisibility. He was no longer a police officer in their eyes, he was a liability. A scapegoat. And, perhaps, a lesson. His suspension had quietly turned into termination. The department eager to distance itself from the controversy. Alone in his small apartment, Jack watched the coverage on television. His name and face a constant presence in the scrolling headlines. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The investigation unfolded methodically, with the precision of a machine that had long been designed for moments like this. DOJ officials arrived at the precinct in dark suits and carried themselves with the quiet authority of those accustomed to navigating fraught situations. Their presence was felt immediately. Conversations stopped when they entered a room. Officers avoided their gaze, and the weight of their scrutiny hung over every desk and file. The investigators began with interviews, starting with Chief Holloway and working their way down the chain of command. They asked about training protocols, use of force policies, and past complaints. Nothing was off limits. The question wasn't just whether Jack Mather had acted improperly, it was whether the department had allowed him to. For many officers, the interviews dredged up memories they would have preferred to forget. Traffic stops that had escalated unnecessarily. Complaints that had been quietly filed away. And decisions made in the name of expediency rather than justice. The investigators listened to every word, their notebooks filling with details that painted a picture far larger than one afternoon in a suburban park. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Ethan Carter followed the investigation closely, though from a measured distance. He knew his involvement could be seen as a conflict of interest. But he also knew that his presence was a silent reminder that accountability was non-negotiable. The sight of DOJ officials walking into the precinct was a small comfort. A sign that the system, slow and imperfect as it was, could still function. At home, Amara asked questions he struggled to answer. Do they think he's sorry? She asked one evening, her small voice breaking the quiet. Ethan looked up from the stack of papers on the kitchen table. The beginnings of his own report on the case. I don't know, he admitted, but that's not what this is about. It's about making sure people like him can't hurt anyone else. Amara nodded thoughtfully, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. Do you think it will change anything? Ethan hesitated. He wanted to tell her yes. To promise her that the world would be different because of what had happened. But the weight of history, of patterns that seemed impossible to break, tempered his words. It might, he said finally, if enough people care. Blank. Underscore. Blank. For Sarah, the investigation brought a different kind of tension. She had agreed to meet with the investigators, to recount every detail of that day for the record. Sitting in a neutral office space downtown, she faced two officials who asked their questions with a calm professionalism that didn't quite mask the gravity of the situation. What was Officer Mather's demeanor when he approached your vehicle? One asked. Sarah thought for a moment. It was tense, she said, like he'd already decided I was guilty of something. And when he opened the passenger door, Sarah's hands tightened on her lap. That's when Amara started to panic. He didn't say anything to her, he just reached for her. She didn't understand what was happening. The questions continued, each one drawing out a memory that Sarah had spent days trying to push away. By the time the interview ended, she felt drained, but also resolute. If reliving those moments could help bring about change, it was worth it. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Outside the precinct, the protests continued. They were no longer just about Amara, they were about a system that had too often failed the people it was supposed to protect. The crowd grew larger each day, with speakers addressing issues that went beyond the specifics of the case. Signs bore messages like, accountability for all, and, end the silence. Among the protesters were people from all walks of life, young and old, black and white, local residents and those who had driven hours to be there. For many, the story of Amara Williams had become a mirror, reflecting their own fears and frustrations. It wasn't just about her. It was about them, too. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the findings became clear. The DOJ report, a meticulous document that ran hundreds of pages, laid bare not only Jack Mather's actions but the department's systemic failings. It detailed patterns of excessive force, racial bias, and a culture of complacency that had allowed complaints to go unanswered. For Chief Holloway, the report was devastating. It wasn't just an indictment of Mather, it was an indictment of his leadership. As he read through the findings, he realized that the consequences would go far beyond one officer. Reforms were inevitable, and so were resignations. For Jack, the report was a grim confirmation of what he already knew. His actions were indefensible, and the system that had shielded him for so long was finally holding him accountable. Criminal charges were filed, and though he hadn't yet faced a jury, he understood the likelihood of his conviction. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Back at home, the Williams family watched the news together, the DOJ's findings dominating the headlines. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder, while Amara leaned against her father's side. What happens now? Amara asked quietly. We keep going, Ethan replied. This is just the beginning. Amara nodded, her eyes thoughtful. The weight of what had happened to her was still there, but so was something else, a quiet determination, a belief that her story could make a difference. For Sarah, Ethan, and Amara, the road ahead was still uncertain. But in the midst of uncertainty, there was hope. The protests outside the precinct, the calls for reform, and the work of the investigators, all of it pointed to a possibility that the world, imperfect as it was, could still change. And that, for now, was enough. The verdict came on a cool autumn afternoon, the kind where the air carried the faintest hint of the season's change. The courtroom was quiet as the judge read the decision, each word deliberate and final. Officer Jack Mather had been found guilty of excessive force and misconduct. For the Williams family, seated together in the gallery, it was a moment of quiet relief rather than triumph. Justice, imperfect and slow, had been served. Outside the courthouse, the crowd gathered once more, their signs a mix of celebration and resolve. The protests that had begun with Amara's story had grown into something larger, a movement demanding change not just in one city but across a nation. Yet even as chants filled the air, there was an understanding among the crowd that the verdict was only a step, not the conclusion. Amara stood with her parents, holding her mother's hand tightly. The voices of the crowd rose around her, but she remained quiet, watching the people as they waved their signs and hugged one another. At 12, she didn't fully understand the scope of what her case had meant to so many. But she felt the weight of it. Do you feel better, her father? Ethan asked gently, crouching beside her. Amara thought for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. A little, she said, but I don't think he understands. Ethan nodded slowly. He might not. Some people don't want to see the truth, even when it's right in front of them. Will it happen again? Amara asked, her voice soft but steady. Her mother, Sarah, leaned down to kiss the top of her head. Maybe, she admitted, but because of you, Amara, it might not happen as often. People are paying attention now. They're listening. Amara didn't reply immediately, but she squeezed her mother's hand in response. In the weeks that followed, the Williams family tried to settle back into their lives. Sarah returned to her work at the community center. Ethan resumed his duties with the FBI. And Amara returned to school. Yet, life didn't quite return to what it had been before. Their days were punctuated by interviews, meetings with advocacy groups, and letters from people who shared their own stories of injustice. At night, Sarah often found herself sitting at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at the stack of letters. Some were from strangers, thanking her for her courage. Others were from parents who had experienced similar encounters, their words heavy with frustration and grief. Sarah read each one carefully, feeling the weight of every story. Jack Mather's sentencing came quietly, without the fanfare of the initial trial. He was sentenced to time in prison, though his lawyer had argued for leniency. In the days leading up to his incarceration, Jack stayed largely out of sight, avoiding the reporters who occasionally lingered outside his apartment building. The man who had once carried himself with confidence now moved through the world with a subdued air. His life reduced to a series of regrets and what-ifs. Jack's story faded from the headlines quickly, replaced by new scandals and controversies. But for him, the silence was more difficult than the scrutiny. He spent his days replaying the events in his mind, trying to pinpoint the moment he had lost control not just of the situation in the park but of himself. The answers, when they came, were not comforting. Months later, Sarah and Amara attended a town hall meeting organized by a local civil rights group. The room was filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, many of whom had been part of the protests that followed Amara's case. The speakers discussed policies and reforms, the need for better training, and the importance of holding those in power accountable. When it was Amara's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She approached the microphone with her mother beside her, her braces clinking softly with each step. Her voice was small but steady as she began. My name is Amara Williams. I'm 12 years old, and I have cerebral palsy. A few months ago, something happened to me that I didn't understand. I was scared, and I thought I did something wrong. But I didn't, and my mom didn't either. She paused, glancing at Sarah before continuing. I know there are people who think this isn't a big deal, that it's just one person or one mistake. But it's not. It happens to people like me all the time. And it's not fair. The audience listened intently, their expressions a mix of sadness and determination. Amara took a deep breath, her small hands gripping the edges of the podium. I just want people to remember that we're all the same, no matter what we look like or how we move. And I want people to think about that the next time they see someone like me. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Amara stepped back, leaning into her mother's side as Sarah wrapped an arm around her. It wasn't the end of the fight, far from it. But it was a moment. A small light in a world that often felt too dark. For the Williams family, life moved forward. The scars of that afternoon in the park remained. But so did the strength they had found in themselves and their community. The world had not changed overnight. But it had shifted, however slightly, in the direction of something better. And sometimes, Sarah thought, that was enough.